Okay, so I am a Java backend developer. Do I need to know how to center a div in HTML? So I interact with a lot of Java backend developers, and this is a question that gets asked often. How much front-end knowledge should I need to learn and know about as a Java backend developer? How much HTML, CSS, and JavaScript skills should I know? And basically the question behind the question, kind of at the heart of the matter is, I already have enough stuff to learn in backend just to keep up as a backend developer. Please don't tell me I have to learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as well. Well, in this video, I'm going to answer this question by providing 3 separate viewpoints. These are 3 real but kind of contrasting viewpoints from several Java backend developers that I have interacted with, both junior and experienced devs. These are also 3 different paths that actual people in the industry have taken and chosen to go on when it comes to front-end knowledge and skills. Now, I'm not just going to say, here are 3 different viewpoints, just pick one. I'm also going to offer some personal recommendations for 3 things that you should be doing if you have this question on your mind. Because this topic is not just a question about skill sets. It kind of gets into the heart of how we perceive and define roles within the software development teams. So 3 real-world industry professional viewpoints and my 3 recommendations. Let's go. So front-end and back-end roles in the software development industry have not stayed constant over the years. They have evolved both rapidly and sometimes they've evolved profoundly. In the early days of web development, it wasn't very strange for developers to wear multiple hats. It wasn't uncommon for developers to wear multiple hats, often handling server-side code and client-side code. There was a time when backend Java developers often found themselves writing JSP files, messing around with JavaScript and jQuery. I kind of remember doing that myself and often had no idea what I was doing. Basically, my strategy was mess around and change random CSS values until the page looked like whatever the UI designer wanted me to build. Now, of course, the landscape has drastically changed. These days, Java developers don't mess around with JSP or free marker templates or whatever else. Of course, I know. If you happen to be one of those few people who are still doing that, well, you have my sympathies, really. But most Java developers don't do that. Most Java developers these days write APIs, not HTML. Why? Well, we have all the advancements in the front-end side of things to thank for. Because you see, today, the world of front-end development is not only complex, it's also constantly evolving. You have a lot of top JavaScript frameworks like Angular, React, and Vue. They see feature additions with every new update, right? This rapid advancement in front-end development has kind of led to this specialization of roles. Front-end developers now work with this huge suite of tools and technologies that are mainly Node and NPM based. We also include dedicated build tools, dependency managers, transpilers. We also sometimes use TypeScript, which is yet another language. So there are a whole lot of stuff, right? This specialization has in many ways created this distinct separation between front-end and back-end development. So in this context, in this modern context, the role of a pure backend developer has also kind of shifted. Many backend developers now focus only on building APIs and backend logic. And they use tools like Postman or REST clients for testing the interaction. They don't use browsers, right? Many companies, backend developers may not even interact with the browser at all. This shift is even more prominent when people are building for multiple channels other than the web. So for example, iOS and Android applications. So if you have 3 different clients who consume your API, now you have a really strong reason to say, I'm not going to learn about any of them. I'm just going to be focusing on the backend. I'm happy here. Well, of course, the concept of a full stack developer still exists, right? It's certainly possible to be proficient in both front-end and back-end technologies. However, for those who identify as pure back-end developers, the question is there a necessity to dive into front-end technologies like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? Is it as pressing as it once was? Now I'm going to present 3 different viewpoints from industry professionals that answer this question. The first viewpoint is what I call the minimalist view. So the minimalist view is a view that's been echoed by many successful backend developers. Their perspective basically is to say a big fat no to anything front end. So they say it's entirely possible to specialize and excel in backend developments with really little to no understanding of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There are numerous seasoned backend developers who have built successful careers while focusing primarily on server-side technologies. These folks will point out that they lack extensive knowledge of front end, and that hasn't hindered career progression or their ability to contribute effectively to their teams. In fact, some of them will argue that concentrating on backend exclusively has helped them kind of deepen their expertise in that area. They can use that time to developing and becoming specialists in technologies like Java, the associated frameworks, databases, server architectures, and all that stuff. The basic philosophy is I'm never going to be good in front-end development, right? I'm never going to be a good front-end developer. So if I'm going to be doing like a half-assed job at it, why even bother to start? I'd rather focus on things that I'm good at or need to be good at, and I'm going to excel in those. So this minimalist approach is particularly applicable for larger teams or organizations where there is this kind of clear delineation between front-end and back-end responsibilities. So in such environments, back-end developers very rarely are expected to engage with front-end code, right? Their primary focus remains on server-side logic and database and APIs and other backend tasks. This kind of specialization allows them to kind of hone in and develop their specific skill sets that are crucial for building out the backend part of the applications. Moreover, this rise of this giant of a technology called microservice architecture, I mean, look at the increasing popularity of it, has led to this practice of what's called API-driven development, which further supports this viewpoint. In these scenarios, backend developers are more concerned with constructing robust, scalable, and secure APIs, and they don't really care about the front end. What front end? It could be a web, it could be iOS. Regardless of the front end technology, they set all that aside and just focus on the front end. So this is the minimalist viewpoint. A professional who has this viewpoint says, well, having a broad skill set may be advantageous, not denying that, but specializing in backend development and mastering the associated skills can lead to a fulfilling and successful career rather than spreading yourself too thin, right? This resonates with many people in the industry. They want to dive deep into the complexities and nuances of backend technologies and leave front-end development to the front-end folks. So this is the minimalist viewpoint. Viewpoint number 2, the full stack view. This viewpoint is, as you can imagine, a polar opposite of the minimalist view. Java professionals who support this, who advocate this, they advocate having knowledge of the full stack, right? Backend and front end. So if you ask these people, how much HTML, CSS, and JavaScript do you need? Their answer is yes, all of it. The full stack developer is, kind of think of it as a jack of all trades when it comes to the software development world. They possess a wide range of skills. They cover both front end and back end technologies. Their idea is, okay, if you're working on a web application, there's work to do on both ends, so to speak. So it helps to be able to kind of work on everything, right? Everything it takes to get an app working. I've heard arguments about the problems of previous specialization, right? The people who believe in full stack says specializations are bad, and they quote examples of previous instances where specializations were bad. For example, in the past, there used to be this testing specialization, right? Developers would just write code and they would hand it off to testers who would write test code and test it, right? It was very common, right? We had this separation, this specialization, and it usually wouldn't turn out well because there was this unnecessary split, right? The test engineer finds a bug, and now they have a dependency on the developer to fix it, right? The developer writes code, but the developer isn't confident until the tester tests it. So in short, it mostly didn't work, right? So the industry over time broke that specialization. Now there are rarely dedicated testing teams anymore unless the application is really, really big or really, really old or really, really crucial in functionality. Now, developers just write tests. It's as simple as that. So the full stack view argument is Why even have this front-end and back-end specialization? Let's have developers who are well-versed across the stack. If you're a Java developer working on back-end, you have to know front-end to get your way around it. Granted, it's a different technology, so the tools of the trade aren't exactly similar. So for example, with the coding and testing example, there were some technologies which were kind of overlapping. So it wasn't entirely different, but with front-end and back-end, the technologies are in fact different. But these people argue, well, that's just the fact that you have to deal with. There are a couple of advantages to this view, right? The primary benefit is the ability to effectively understand and effectively collaborate across the entire spectrum of a project, right? This is especially true with smaller teams or teams that have strict team deadlines and they don't have very strict team boundaries, right, between front end and back end. For a back end developer to have this grasp with front end technologies means you can better appreciate the challenges and constraints that your teammates working on front end face, right? And similarly, you work on front end, you will be able to better understand what backend needs you have, and you can build better backends, right? This enables a more collaborative and efficient working environment, since you can anticipate how your backend decisions will implement and affect frontend, and how your frontend decisions will affect backend. You can make those decisions across the spectrum, and you can build features across the spectrum. So being knowledgeable in both domains allows for a more holistic view of the project development, right? You're not just confined to thinking server-side all the time. You're also thinking about how data and functionality will be presented and interacted with on the client side. Now, this is a huge advantage, but the second and personally more compelling advantage is you'll be a more valued software developer. Full stack engineers demand much better pay. They have much better job opportunities, right? You just make a better and more compelling candidate for companies to hire you. That is, as long as you can successfully demonstrate your full stack knowledge in job interviews. As long as you can do that, you're good to go. However, people who choose full stack development also tend to balance the approach, right? While being a full stack developer has its advantages, it's also crucial to have a strong foundation in your primary area of expertise. For Java backend developers, this means ensuring that your backend skills are solid and well developed before branching out and learning front-end technologies. If you don't do that, then you're probably going to be spreading yourself too thin and trying to learn everything at once, and that can be counterproductive. The goal should be to achieve good level of proficiency in the backend development, and then it allows you to handle complex tasks and challenges there, and then you complement your expertise with front-end knowledge. All right, the third viewpoint, right? It's not full backend, it's not full stack. The third viewpoint says there isn't a right answer. There isn't a way to answer this one way or another. It really depends on your role and your current job. Basically, your level of knowledge of HTML and CSS that's necessary for a Java backend developer depends on the specific requirements of your role, your team, your project, or your company. You see, software development processes vary a lot between companies and organizations, and even between teams inside the same organization. They draw lines differently. In some cases, the same developer might be asked to work on front end. Some other times, they might be asked to work on back end. So this camp advocates don't have those boundaries, don't have labels. There's no back-end engineer, there's no front-end engineer, there isn't even a full stack engineer. There are software engineers, the software programmers, and there are applications to build and write. So as a programmer, you just learn what's necessary to get the job done, and then you do it. Go where the project takes you and where your application that you and your team are working on needs help. Basically, go where work takes you and you learn along the way. This doesn't mean that you need to be an expert in front-end development or back-end development when the need comes. It trusts that you, as a software developer, can do what it takes to learn what it takes to get the job done. While this might sound like a bit of an extreme position, it's actually quite common in terms of expectations for programmers in two different types of companies. First is, if you're working in a startup, you will see this, right? In startups, developers are expected to wear different hats, and it's not just true for development needs. Sometimes software developers in smaller startups are expected to do UX design, to do product management and user study and all kinds of stuff. There are other environments where I've seen this, where people reject these labels, are in tech-first product companies like Google or a Facebook. In those companies, more value is given to a programmer rather than their current skills and their current knowledge. I've seen programmers in those companies kind of switch languages and technologies and frameworks without thinking twice. So these companies assume that these are skilled programmers and they can pick up anything. Of course, there are specialized engineers in those companies. It's still kind of the norm there, but I've noticed that they don't stick to those labels as much as other companies, right? They are a little more flexible, they're a little more loose. They go, okay, what does the project need? What does the product need? And they kind of hop based on that need. The problem, the disadvantage with this approach is that you do this for a few years, your resume is going to be all over the place. And when you're searching for the next job, you will probably need to go to another company that doesn't value these labels either, because you will be unlabelable at that point, right? But still, if you're okay with that, that's a good and a fun path for your career. All right, so we've looked at 3 viewpoints. Now the obvious question is, which one should you choose? Well, obviously, there is no right answer here. There are plenty of software professionals who have taken each of these options and they have thrived in their careers. So it really depends on you. But no matter what path you take, there are a few things that are a must. And I will give you 3 recommendations that you can start out with while you're choosing, right? These are must-dos in my opinion if you're a Java backend developer. Recommendation number 1, you understand the plumbing of frontend, right? Here's what I suggest. You may not want to delve into the intricacies of React or be able to put together an HTML page, but I think it's essential to understand the part of the front end that's adjacent to the backend, or let's just say it overlaps with the backend a little bit. For example, learn how HTTP works, learn how REST works in detail, learn how cookies are stored in the browser, learn what authentication headers are, learn how browsers manage a state in rich client applications and how rich client pages handle state, right? Understand how frameworks make API calls, how their page load works, learn how their routers work. This kind of knowledge gives you a lot of insight into the thing that's actually making calls to the Java backend that you're building. Of course, I say this is for the web, but if you're building a backend for, let's say, iOS or Android, go learn those corresponding things as well, right? It's important to know what is calling your API. It's especially important for other kinds of interactions, like let's say you have a GraphQL client or you're working with protocols like gRPC. Understand that plumbing, So that's recommendation number 1, right? You're going to have to do this no matter which path you take among the 3 that I've discussed. Recommendation number 2, understand the basics that are necessary for troubleshooting. Know enough to spin up front-end code on your machine and mess around with it. Even before I started learning about front-end stacks and my interest in Angular and React, I used to find it super handy to be able to start front-end apps on my machine and see kind of like the full experience end-to-end, right? The end-to-end flow of the backend API, data reaching the front end and manifesting in the UI. An added bonus, if you have the ability to make some small changes in the UI and you work on the backend, you perhaps added a new field, you want to make a change in the UI and see that new field showing up and reflected. Things don't have to look very pretty, right? Just functional. You have the ability to make functional changes to the UI. It's almost like an integration test for your backend without depending on the front-end engineer for every little thing. That's a really important thing that you need to be able to do as a backend engineer, right? That's recommendation number 2. And finally, recommendation number 3, keep learning and exploring, right? Irrespective of whether you want to go full stack or stay backend only or anything in between, it is critical for all of us to keep our interests open and constantly keep learning. You may choose to label yourself as full stack or backend only or whatever else on your resume, but don't label yourself when it comes to learning, right? No need to be an expert, right? You don't have to be an expert React developer. Just spend a weekend trying out React if you haven't already. You might like it, you might enjoy it. In fact, you might enjoy it enough that you might consider switching or maybe considering a full stack role. This applies to other fields as well, by the way. You can try data science, machine learning, mobile app development. Just spend a week in each. Do 1 week in a month, right? And in 4 months, you would have covered all of the technology options that I've just shared. You would have some idea. You would obviously not be an expert, but who knows? At the end, you might find something interesting. And by the end of it, you might have even learned how to center a div in HTML. All right, so with the theme of learning and development, I encourage you to click one of the videos that are showing up on your screen right now and learn something new. Go on, give it a try.